Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of his massive warship and looked at the stars through the wide window. His ship was called the Eternal Dominion, and it was the biggest and most powerful vessel in the entire Zephyrian fleet. For over 3,000 years his people had ruled the galaxy, and no one had ever dared to fight them. 2,000 star systems bowed to their empire and paid taxes to keep the peace. The Admiral was old even by his people's standards, but his mind was still sharp. His blue-scaled skin showed the marks of many battles, and his 4 arms moved with practiced ease as he worked the control panels. Today should have been like any other day of patrolling the outer edges of Empire space, but something strange had appeared on their sensors. Lieutenant Velnok approached with quick steps and saluted. The young officer's voice shook slightly as he spoke. A signal had been detected from an unknown system that was not on any of their star charts. The signal was weak, but it was clearly artificial, and came from the 3rd planet of a small yellow. Star Kethvar ordered his fleet to move toward the signal. His ships used the standard jump drives that all civilized species had developed over millions of years. The technology bent space around the vessels and allowed them to travel faster than light. It was reliable and had served the Empire well for countless generations. When they arrived at the strange system, the Admiral saw something that surprised him. The 3rd planet was covered in blue oceans and green land masses. Scans showed that it was full of life and had a civilization that had just learned to send radio signals into space. The beings called themselves humans, and their world was named Earth. The humans were primitive by galactic standards. They had only recently split. The Atom and their fastest ships could barely leave their own planet's gravity well. Their cities were made of simple materials like metal and concrete. Their weapons were chemical explosives and basic energy devices. By all measurements, they were at least 500 years behind the most basic spacefaring civilizations. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the command center of Earth's defense headquarters when the alien signal came through. He was a tall man with brown hair and steady gray eyes who had fought in the recent wars that unified his planet under one government. The message from the aliens was simple and clear. Surrender now, or face the power of the mighty Zephyrian Empire. Morrison looked at the translation on his screen and smiled. He had been waiting for this day ever since the scientists had made their breakthrough 20 years ago. The discovery had changed everything humanity thought they knew about how the universe worked. While other species had spent millions of years perfecting conventional technology, humans had found a completely different path. He pressed a button and sent a reply to the alien fleet. Earth would not surrender, and the Zephyrians were welcome to try and take their planet if they thought they could. Then he activated the defense protocols that had been prepared for exactly this situation. The first thing Admiral Kethvar noticed was wrong with the human ships. When they appeared on his sensors, they were not following any known principles of space travel. The vessels seemed to appear and disappear without using jump drives or any other recognizable propulsion system. They moved in patterns that defied the basic laws of physics that governed all matter in the universe. Commander Lisa Parker watched the alien fleet from her station on Earth's primary defense platform. She was a short woman with red hair and green eyes who had helped design the system she now operated. The technology humans used was based on discoveries that no other species had ever made. Instead of working within the laws of physics, they had learned to work around them. The human ships did not burn fuel or generate thrust in any conventional way. They moved by convincing reality that they had always been in the place they wanted to go. Space and time bent around them not because of massive energy expenditure, but because the universe had been politely asked to make an exception to its normal rules. When the first Zephyrian scout ship tried to scan a human vessel, the readings made no sense. The target appeared to be in 17 different locations at the same time. Its mass registered as both incredibly heavy and completely weightless. The energy signatures showed patterns that violated the conservation laws that all technology was built upon. Jake Morrison gave the order for Earth's ships to move into position. The vessel he commanded was called the Independence, and it looked like no warship any alien had ever seen. Its hull was made of materials that existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its engines ran on principles that most species would call magic if they believed in such things. The human fleet arranged itself in a formation that seemed random to the watching aliens, but followed a deeper logic. Each ship was connected to the others through quantum entanglement networks that allowed them to share information instantly across any distance. They could coordinate their actions as if they were all parts of a single massive organism. Admiral Kethvar ordered his weapons, officers to target the human vessels, but the computers could not get a lock. The enemy ships seemed to exist in a state of constant probability flux. They were there and not there at the same time. The targeting systems had been designed to track objects that obeyed normal physics, and they could not process targets that refused to follow those rules. The Zephyrian admiral had conquered dozens of worlds and faced every type of enemy the galaxy had produced. He had fought against species with advanced energy shields and others with powerful kinetic barriers. He had defeated foes who used stealth technology and those who relied on overwhelming firepower. But he had never encountered an enemy that simply ignored the fundamental laws that governed all matter and energy. Morrison opened a communication channel to the alien fleet. His message was broadcast in their language, and his voice was calm and friendly. He told them that Earth was willing to talk and find a peaceful solution but would defend itself if attacked. He warned them that human technology worked differently than what they were used to, and that they might want to reconsider their approach. The admiral listened to the humans' words and felt something he had not experienced in centuries of warfare. For the first time since he was a young officer, he was facing something he did not understand. The confidence that had carried him through countless victories began to crack as he realized that everything he thought he knew about space combat might be wrong. Admiral Kethvar decided that words were useless and action was needed. His empire had not conquered 2,000 star systems by talking to primitives. He ordered his fleet to attack formation and prepared to show these humans what real military power looked like. The Eternal Dominion's main guns could destroy small moons, and his escort ships carried enough firepower to burn the surface off an entire planet. The weapons charged with a deep humming sound that vibrated through the hull of every Zephyrian vessel. Plasma cannons that had never failed to penetrate enemy defenses locked onto the human ships. Energy beams that could cut through the strongest known materials prepared to fire. Missile batteries loaded with warheads that could crack continents, armed themselves for launch. Jake Morrison felt the familiar calm that came over him during combat. He had trained for this moment his entire adult life, and now it was finally here. The alien fleet was impressive by conventional standards, but they were thinking in old ways about warfare. They were trying to apply 20th century solutions to 21st century problems. He gave the order to activate Earth's primary defense grid. The system that responded was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of generating energy shields or deploying physical barriers, it created zones of altered probability around the human fleet. In these zones, certain events simply became statistically impossible. The first wave of Zephyrian plasma fire streaked toward the human ships at near light speed. The bolts contained enough energy to vaporize entire city blocks and had never been stopped by any known defensive technology. They struck the probability fields around the human vessels, and something impossible happened. The energy beams simply ceased to exist. They did not bounce off shields or get absorbed by armor plating. They did not lose coherence or disperse harmlessly into space. They vanished completely as if they had never been fired in the first place. The conservation of energy that governed all physical processes was politely ignored, and the universe pretended that the weapons had never been used. Dr. Alex Chen monitored the defense systems from his laboratory deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. He was a thin man with black hair and thick glasses who had spent 15 years developing the theoretical framework that made human technology possible. His equations described reality not as a fixed set of rules, but as a flexible system that could be negotiated with if you knew the right approach. The quantum probability manipulators that protected Earth's fleet worked by adjusting the likelihood of various outcomes occurring. By changing the mathematical equations that described how matter and energy behaved, they could make enemy attacks become impossible events. It was not about having stronger defenses, but about convincing the universe that the attacks had never happened. Commander Velnox stared at his instrument panel in disbelief. His sensors showed that his ship's weapons had fired, but the energy readings indicated that nothing had left the gun barrels. The targeting computers confirmed hits on enemy vessels, but the damage assessments came back as 0 across the board. His years of training had not prepared him for a situation where the laws of physics appeared to be malfunctioning. Colonel Ryan Davis commanded the human counterattack from the bridge of his ship, the Liberty Bell. Unlike the Zephyrian vessels that relied on conventional weapons, his ship was armed with devices that worked by convincing matter to behave differently. The hull plating of enemy ships was not destroyed, but rather persuaded to become something else entirely. The first Zephyrian cruiser to experience human offensive technology found its armor transforming into breathable atmosphere. The metal that had been forged in stellar furnaces and strengthened with advanced alloys decided that it preferred to exist as oxygen and nitrogen. The ship's structure began to dissolve not through heat or impact, but through a fundamental change in what its component atoms wanted to be. Admiral Kethvar watched in horror as one of his escort vessels simply came apart. There were no explosions or energy discharges. The ship's hull flowed like water and then dispersed into a cloud of gas that his crew could breathe if they had been outside their own vessel. The process was silent and peaceful, but utterly devastating. The human weapons did not follow any principles that Zephyrian science could explain. They did not generate destructive energy or launch physical projectiles. Instead, they projected fields that convinced matter to spontaneously rearrange itself according to new rules. Enemy ships were not blown up, but rather talked into becoming something completely different. Lisa Parker coordinated the defense from her command station and felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. The technology that protected her world was beautiful in its elegance but terrible in its implications. Humanity had learned to rewrite the basic code that ran the universe, and the responsibility that came with such power was almost overwhelming. The battle continued for several hours, but it was unlike any space combat that had ever been recorded. Zephyrian ships fired continuously, but their weapons had no effect on targets that existed in probability states where being hit was mathematically impossible. Human vessels responded with attacks that transformed enemy hulls into random collections of harmless substances. Some Zephyrian ships found their reactor cores deciding to become decorative flowers. Others watched their weapon systems transform into musical instruments that played haunting melodies across the radio spectrum. One unfortunate cruiser had its entire superstructure convinced to become a flock of small birds that flew away into the vacuum of space and somehow survived there. Dr. Chen received reports from the battlefield and shook his head in amazement. The theoretical models had predicted that their technology would be effective, but seeing it work in practice was still incredible. They were not just defeating an enemy fleet, but demonstrating that reality itself was far more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. The Zephyrian admiral tried every weapon in his arsenal and every tactical approach he had learned in 3 centuries of warfare. Nothing worked against an enemy that could simply decide that attacks had never occurred. His ships could not target vessels that existed in multiple probability states simultaneously. His sensors could not track objects that refused to follow the normal rules of space and time. As the battle reached its climax, Morrison opened another communication channel to the alien fleet. He offered them a chance to withdraw and report back to their superiors what they had witnessed. His voice carried no anger or hostility, but rather a genuine desire to avoid unnecessary destruction. He warned them that human defensive capabilities were far greater than what they had so far demonstrated. Kethvar looked around his bridge at officers who stared at their instruments with expressions of complete bewilderment. In all his years of service, he had never seen technology that operated outside the fundamental laws that governed the universe. These humans had not just developed better weapons and stronger defenses. They had somehow learned to make reality itself into their ally. The admiral made the hardest decision of his military career and ordered his remaining ships to retreat. As the Zephyrian fleet withdrew from Earth's solar system, he knew that everything had changed. The Empire would need to completely rethink their understanding of what was possible in warfare and technology. The humans had shown them that the universe was far stranger and more malleable than anyone had ever suspected. Admiral Kethvar's emergency transmission reached the Imperial core worlds within hours of his retreat from the human system. His report was so unusual that the High Command initially thought his communication systems had been damaged by enemy action. No primitive species had ever forced a Zephyrian fleet to withdraw, and the idea that it had happened seemed impossible to accept. Emperor Zethral himself reviewed the battle recordings from his palace on the capital world. The massive ruler sat on his crystal throne and watched the footage with growing disbelief. Ships that ignored the laws of physics and weapons that convinced matter to become something else entirely were beyond anything in the Empire's experience. He immediately authorized the largest military response in Zephyrian history. The second wave fleet that assembled at the rally point near Earth's system was a sight that would have terrified any known civilization. 500 warships of various classes formed a battle formation that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. At the center of the armada was the experimental superweapon called Void Render that had been designed to destroy entire solar systems if necessary. General Patricia Brooks observed the incoming alien fleet from Earth's Strategic Command Center buried deep beneath the North American continent. She was a gray-haired woman with sharp blue eyes who had been planning for this exact scenario since the first contact protocols had been established. The massive enemy response was actually what human strategists had expected and prepared for. She authorized the deployment of humanity's newest defensive technology that had been held in reserve during the first battle. The temporal displacement fields represented the cutting edge of human reality manipulation research. They allowed objects to exist slightly ahead of the current timeline, which made them effectively immune to conventional attacks while still able to affect the present. Lieutenant Commander Sam Rodriguez piloted his experimental craft Paradigm Shift through the gap between normal space and the quantum foam that underlied all reality. His ship did not move through three-dimensional coordinates, but instead traveled through conceptual dimensions where ideas and possibilities had physical substance. From this realm, he could attack the very thoughts that held enemy vessels together. The Zephyrian reinforcement fleet arrived, expecting to find the wreckage of Admiral Kethvar's ships scattered around the human homeworld. Instead, they discovered something that hurt their minds to contemplate. The original fleet was simultaneously destroyed and intact, existing in multiple timeline states at once. Ships that had been blown apart were also perfectly functional, creating recursive loops of causality that made no logical sense. Fleet Admiral Drakon commanded the massive armada and had earned his rank through victories against the most dangerous enemies the Empire had ever faced. He had defeated rebel coalitions and crushed pirate federations that had threatened Imperial stability. But as he looked at the sensor readings from the human system, he felt his confidence begin to crumble. The human fleet that rose to meet his armada was much larger than intelligence reports had suggested. Earth's shipyards had been working around the clock since first contact to produce vessels that operated on principles no other species understood. Each human ship was a masterwork of applied impossibility that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute rules. Morrison coordinated the human response from his flagship Independence, which had been upgraded with the latest reality manipulation systems. His ship now existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously and could attack enemies from angles that did not exist in normal space. The vessel's weapons fired bullets made of crystallized mathematics that rewrote the equations governing whatever they struck. The battle began when Admiral Drakon ordered his advanced squadrons to test the human defenses. Plasma cannons that could melt asteroids and particle beams that could cut through planetary cores fired at maximum power. The energy unleashed in the first few minutes would have been enough to sterilize a dozen worlds, but it had no effect on targets that had decided such attacks were philosophically impossible. Dr. Chen watched the combat from his laboratory and marveled at how well the human systems were performing under stress. The quantum probability manipulators were handling the massive energy inputs from the alien fleet and converting them into harmless phenomena. Enemy weapons fire was being transformed into beautiful light displays and soothing music that played across all radio frequencies. The Zephyrian ships found themselves fighting an enemy that operated outside every rule of engagement that had ever been developed. Human vessels appeared and disappeared without warning, existing in probability clouds that made targeting impossible. When the aliens did manage to score direct hits, their weapons had no effect on ships that existed in timeline states where the attacks had never occurred. Some human craft attacked by convincing Zephyrian vessels that they had always been on the wrong side of the battle. Enemy ships suddenly found themselves firing on their own allies as their navigation computers decided that up was down and friend was foe. Others lost the ability to remember how to maintain basic structural integrity as human weapons attacked, the very concepts that held them together. The Void Render moved into position at the center of the alien formation and prepared to fire its reality-destroying beam. The superweapon was the Empire's ultimate expression of destructive technology, capable of erasing matter from existence at the quantum level. Its energy output could unmake entire star systems and leave nothing but empty space where worlds had once orbited. Patricia Brooks authorized the activation of Earth's ultimate defensive measure as she watched the alien superweapon charge its primary systems. The planetary consciousness field that surrounded her world was humanity's greatest achievement in reality manipulation. It allowed the entire planet to act as a single quantum entity with the ability to simply refuse to acknowledge attacks that it found objectionable. When the Void Render fired its annihilation beam at Earth, the weapon performed exactly as designed. The energy pulse traveled at the speed of light and struck the planet with enough force to unmake the fundamental particles that composed all matter. By every law of physics that governed the universe, the human homeworld should have been erased from existence, leaving nothing behind but cosmic dust. Instead, something unprecedented happened that would be studied by scientists for generations to come. Earth looked at the attack that was meant to destroy it and decided that such a thing was simply not acceptable. The planet's quantum consciousness field rejected the premise that it could be destroyed and convinced the universe that the Void Render's beam was actually a friendly greeting rather than a weapon of mass destruction. The annihilation energy that struck Earth's surface was converted into fertile soil and clean water that helped crops grow better across all the inhabited continents. The deadly radiation became warm sunlight that made people feel happy and energetic. The weapon that was supposed to end all life on the planet instead made it more beautiful and peaceful than it had ever been before. Admiral Drakon stared at his sensor readings and felt his sanity begin to slip away. His most powerful weapon had not only failed to destroy the enemy homeworld, but had apparently made it better. The energy signatures coming from the planet showed increased agricultural output and improved weather patterns. Somehow, the humans had turned a planet killer into a gardening tool. The rest of the Zephyrian fleet found themselves trapped in causality loops that defied every principle of temporal mechanics. Ships that tried to retreat discovered they had never left their starting positions. Vessels that attempted to attack found their weapons firing backwards through time at targets that had not yet been selected. The normal flow of cause and effect had broken down completely around the human defenders. Rodriguez guided his ship through the conceptual dimensions and began attacking the fundamental ideas that allowed the alien fleet to function as a coherent force. He convinced their formation algorithms that clustering together was actually a form of cowardice. He persuaded their communication systems that orders from superior officers were just suggestions that could be safely ignored. Slowly, but surely, the massive armada began to fall apart as its crews forgot how to work together effectively. The news of the Second Fleet's impossible defeat reached the Imperial Council chambers on Zephyr Prime through emergency channels that had never been used in living memory. Chief Science Advisor Veltar received the battle recordings while attending a routine meeting about resource allocation and nearly dropped his datapad when he saw what the humans had accomplished. The footage showed technology that violated every principle his people had spent millions of years developing. Veltar was considered the greatest scientific mind of his generation and had personally overseen the development of most Imperial technologies currently in use. His 4 arms moved frantically over multiple control panels as he analyzed the sensor data from the battle. No matter how many times he reviewed the information, the conclusions remained the same. The humans were not using advanced technology, but rather technology that should not exist at all. The emergency session that followed brought together the Empire's most brilliant minds to discuss what they had witnessed. Physicists who had unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel sat beside engineers who had designed weapons capable of cracking planets. All of them stared at the evidence in stunned silence as they realized that everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. Dr. Kate Williams sat in her office at the Xenotechnology Research Institute on Earth and reviewed the communication that had just arrived from the Zephyrian Empire. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a major military power was requesting a diplomatic meeting not to negotiate surrender terms, but to ask for an explanation of how their defeat had been possible. The message was not angry or threatening, but rather desperate and confused. The request had come through official channels, but the tone was completely different from the Empire's previous communications. Instead of demands for submission, there were polite inquiries about the possibility of dialogue. The Zephyrians were not seeking terms for conquest, but rather hoping to understand what they had encountered. Their entire worldview had been shattered by contact with human technology. Ambassador Peter Jackson was selected to lead the first diplomatic mission because of his background in both xenobiology and theoretical physics. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes who had spent decades preparing for the moment when humanity would need to explain their unique approach to technology. The weight of representing his entire species in this crucial negotiation was not lost on him. The neutral meeting station established at the edge of Earth's solar system was itself a demonstration of human capabilities. The structure existed in normal space but was constructed from materials that had been convinced to behave in ways that defied conventional understanding. The station's walls were transparent from the inside but completely opaque from outside perspectives. Its gravity generators worked by asking space-time to bend slightly rather than using massive energy expenditures. Jackson brought with him a collection of items that would fundamentally alter how the Empire understood the relationship between consciousness and reality. The demonstration materials were not exotic weapons or complex machinery, but rather simple objects that any human child might play with on a typical afternoon. The implications of what these toys could do would send shockwaves through every scientific institution in the galaxy. The first item he presented was a puzzle cube that had been popular among human children for decades. When Jackson handed it to science advisor Veltar, the alien researcher expected to see an interesting but unremarkable mechanical device. Instead, he watched in amazement as the cube's colored squares rearranged themselves by convincing their component parts that they had always been in the solved configuration. The toy had not moved through intermediate steps, but had simply decided that being unsolved was an unacceptable state. The second demonstration involved a simple toy spaceship that looked like something from a children's adventure story. Jackson activated the small craft, and it immediately achieved faster-than-light travel by persuading the universe that distance was merely a suggestion that could be politely ignored. The toy moved from one end of the meeting room to the other by taking a shortcut through dimensions that most species had never discovered existed. Commander Maria Santos explained the fundamental difference between human and galactic approaches to technology development. While other species had spent eons learning to work within the constraints of natural laws, humanity had discovered that those laws were far more flexible than anyone had realized. They had not broken physics, but rather learned to negotiate with it on terms that benefited both parties. The revelation sent tremors through every level of Zephyrian society as word of the meeting spread through official channels. Scientists who had dedicated their lives to understanding immutable physical constants suddenly faced the possibility that those constants were actually variables in an equation that could be solved differently. Engineers who had built their careers on working within known limitations realized they had been thinking far too small. Jackson showed them a child's kaleidoscope that displayed patterns existing in dimensions the Empire had never detected. The simple toy revealed geometric relationships that made their most advanced mathematics look primitive by comparison. Each turn of the device showed new configurations of reality that suggested the universe was far larger and more complex than they had ever imagined. The human ambassador explained that these demonstrations were not meant to show off or intimidate, but rather to illustrate how different their technological development had been. Where other species had focused on understanding and manipulating natural forces, humanity had learned to have conversations with those forces. They treated the fundamental laws of physics not as absolute rules, but as guidelines that could be modified through respectful negotiation. Veltar felt his understanding of existence crumbling as he watched a simple human toy convince gravity to flow upward instead of down. The device was not generating energy fields or creating artificial forces, but rather asking the universe to make a small exception to its normal operations. The implications were staggering because if fundamental forces could be negotiated with, then everything his people had built their civilization upon was based on incomplete knowledge. The meeting continued for several days, as Jackson patiently explained the philosophical foundations that had allowed humanity to develop their unique relationship with reality. He described how human scientists had discovered that consciousness and physical laws were not separate phenomena, but rather different aspects of the same underlying system. By learning to communicate with the quantum processes that governed matter and energy, they had gained the ability to influence how those processes operated. The most shocking revelation came when Jackson demonstrated that human children routinely played with toys that operated on the same principles as their most advanced weapons. A simple spinning top convinced the meeting room that time should move slower in its immediate vicinity. A set of building blocks spontaneously arranged themselves into structures that existed in more dimensions than the room could normally contain. These were not experimental prototypes, but mass-produced items that could be purchased in any human toy store. The implications began to sink in as the Zephyrian delegation realized what they were seeing. Humanity had not just developed superior military technology, but had created an entire civilization based on principles that made the Empire's achievements look primitive. Their children played with devices that casually violated the laws of physics, while the Empire's greatest scientists struggled to understand how such things were possible. Emperor Zethral reviewed the reports from the diplomatic mission and felt the foundations of his empire shifting beneath him. For thousands of years, his people had been the undisputed masters of galactic technology. They had conquered worlds and civilizations through superior firepower and advanced engineering. Now they faced the humbling realization that a species they had dismissed as primitive had surpassed them in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The Emperor made a decision that would define the next chapter of galactic history. Instead of continuing to view humanity as a threat to be eliminated, He would approach them as teachers who might help his empire evolve beyond its current limitations. The Zephyrians would need to fundamentally rethink their understanding of technology and reality itself if they wanted to remain relevant in a universe where the impossible had become routine. Jackson concluded the diplomatic meeting by extending an invitation that would change everything. Earth was willing to share their knowledge and help other species learn to develop their own reality manipulation capabilities. However, he warned that the process would require abandoning many long-held beliefs about how the universe worked. Not every species would be capable of making such a dramatic shift in thinking, but those who could would find themselves capable of achievements they had never imagined possible. Emperor Zethral made a decision that shocked every member of his imperial court and sent waves of disbelief throughout the 2,000 star systems under his rule. For the first time in the 3,000-year history of the Zephyrian Empire, the supreme ruler would personally leave the capital world to meet with representatives of another species. The announcement caused such surprise that several high-ranking officials required medical attention after fainting during the emergency council session. The Emperor's personal transport was the most advanced vessel in the Imperial fleet and had never been used for diplomatic missions. The Golden Dominion was equipped with shields that could withstand supernovas and weapons that could crack moons, but Zethral ordered all aggressive systems powered down for the journey to human space. He was not traveling as a conqueror, but as a student, seeking to understand how everything his people believed about reality could be wrong. Captain Ben Tyler welcomed the alien ruler aboard his ship, Cognitive Dissonance, with the same casual friendliness he might show to any visitor. The human vessel was a masterpiece of applied impossibility that existed primarily as an idea made manifest in physical form. Its hull was constructed from crystallized thoughts about what a spaceship should be, and its engines ran on the collective imagination of its crew members. The Emperor's first shock came when he realized that the ship's interior contained more space than its external dimensions could possibly hold. The corridors stretched for kilometers inside a hull that sensor readings showed was only a few hundred meters long. When he asked Tyler to explain this contradiction, the human captain simply smiled and said that the ship had politely asked the universe to make an exception to normal spatial relationships. The meeting took place in a conference room that changed its decoration and layout based on the emotional needs of the people inside it. As Emperor Zethral entered the space, the walls shifted to display calming images of his homeworld's crystal forests, while the gravity adjusted itself to match the comfort levels he preferred. The room was not just accommodating his physical requirements, but responding to psychological states he had not even been aware of experiencing. Dr. Rachel North led the human scientific delegation and had spent her entire career developing the theoretical frameworks that made reality manipulation possible. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright green eyes who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to have conversations with the fundamental forces of the universe. Her presence made the Emperor feel like a child trying to understand concepts far beyond his current level of development. The humans began their presentation with a demonstration that would have been considered impossible by every scientific institution in the galaxy. Dr. North handed Emperor Zethral a simple communication device that looked like nothing more than a smooth metal disc. When he activated it, the device immediately connected him to random people throughout the galaxy, regardless of distance or dimensional barriers. The communicator worked by convincing space and time that all locations were equally valid places for conversation. The first call connected him to a farmer on a world 50,000 light-years away who was surprised but pleased to chat with the Emperor about crop rotation techniques. The second call reached a deep space explorer who was currently traveling between galaxies and wanted to discuss the beautiful nebula formations he was passing through. Each conversation was crystal clear, with no transmission delays despite the impossible distances involved. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Adams demonstrated the device's more advanced capabilities by showing how it could contact people in different time periods. The Emperor found himself speaking to historical figures from his own planet's past, and even managed to have a brief conversation with a version of himself from several hours in the future. The implications of casual time travel communication made his head spin as he contemplated what this technology could mean for Imperial administration. The humans explained that their approach to technological development was based on a simple premise that other species had never considered. Instead of viewing the laws of physics as absolute constraints that must be worked around, they treated those laws as the opening moves in a negotiation that could potentially be modified through respectful discussion. The universe was not a machine that operated according to fixed programming, but rather a living system that was willing to consider alternative arrangements. Dr. North showed the Emperor how human children learned these principles from an early age through educational toys that casually violated conventional physics. A simple set of building blocks could construct structures that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. A toy car could travel to any destination by convincing distance that it was actually much shorter than measurement indicated. These were not advanced experimental devices, but common items that could be found in any human household. The revelation that human children routinely played with reality-bending technology while his empire's greatest scientists struggled to understand. Basic faster-than-light travel was perhaps the most humbling moment of Emperor Zethral's long life. He began to understand that humanity had not simply developed better technology, but had discovered that the universe itself was far more cooperative and flexible than anyone had ever imagined. The discussion turned to the practical implications of sharing human knowledge with the galactic community. Dr. North warned that learning to manipulate reality required a fundamental shift in thinking that many species might find impossible to achieve. The mental flexibility needed to negotiate with physical laws was not something that could be taught through traditional educational methods, but rather had to be developed through years of careful practice and philosophical preparation. Some species would adapt quickly to the new paradigm, while others might never be able to make the necessary conceptual leaps. The Zephyrians had advantages in that their culture valued scientific inquiry, and their minds were already accustomed to complex mathematical thinking. However, they would need to abandon millions of years of assumptions about how technology should work and be willing to embrace approaches that might seem like magic rather than science. Tyler offered to give the Emperor a tour of his ship's more exotic systems to demonstrate what became possible once a species learned to treat reality as a collaborative partner rather than an obstacle to overcome. They visited the engine room where the drives operated by having philosophical discussions with the quantum vacuum about the nature of motion and distance. The power generators ran on conversations between matter and energy about their preferred states of existence. The ship's weapons systems were perhaps the most impressive demonstration of human technological philosophy. Instead of devices designed to destroy enemies, they were tools that convinced hostile forces to reconsider their aggressive intentions. Enemy weapons could be persuaded to fire flowers instead of plasma bolts. Hostile ships could be talked into believing they were actually on the same side as their targets. War became less about destruction and more about creative problem-solving. Emperor Zethral realized that he was witnessing the birth of a new age in galactic civilization. The humans were offering to share knowledge that would revolutionize every aspect of how societies functioned. Transportation could become instantaneous once vehicles learned to negotiate with distance. Communication could transcend all barriers once messages convinced time and space to carry them anywhere. Energy production could become unlimited once matter and energy agreed to work together more efficiently. The Emperor faced a choice that would determine his empire's future for generations to come. He could attempt to integrate human methods into existing Zephyrian frameworks and risk the chaos that such dramatic changes might bring, or he could maintain traditional approaches and accept that his people would become increasingly irrelevant as other species learned to manipulate reality itself. As the meeting drew to a close, Tyler made an offer that summarized everything the Emperor had learned. He handed him a small device that looked like a simple pen, but was actually a reality editor capable of making minor modifications to local physical laws. The tool could convince gravity to flow in different directions or persuade time to move at altered speeds. It was a children's toy by human standards, but represented technology beyond anything the Empire had ever produced. The Emperor accepted the gift and felt the weight of infinite possibility in his hands. The device was not just a tool, but a symbol of humanity's approach to existence itself. They had learned to see the universe not as a collection of rigid rules that must be obeyed, but as a living system that was willing to consider new arrangements, if approached with respect and creativity. The age of conventional physics was ending, and something far more wonderful was beginning. Humanity had proven that reality was far more negotiable than anyone had ever dared to believe. The galaxy would never be the same because the impossible had become not just possible but routine. The future would be written by those species wise, enough to learn that the universe's greatest secret was its willingness to listen to new ideas about how things should work.